In the dying days of World War II, Willie Stehr, my opa or grandfather, a peasant farmer from a small village in Lithuania, found himself cowering with the remnants of the German Defense Force in Czechoslovakia. He was working as a cook's helper and a cleaner for the army. They were all nervously waiting for the inevitable Russian invasion. No one knew what would happen to them, and Willie would soon find out he would fare worse than most of the men he waited with. The harsh conditions everyone faced during the war, insufficient nutrition, unsanitary conditions, and rudimentary health care made his age of 49 seem quite old. It was not until January 1945 that he was drafted in the Volkssturm, or People's Storm. This home guard was the Nazis' last-ditch effort to defend the country with old men and young boys, previously too old or young to fight. He was taught to use a gun and a bazooka and was moved to Dresden to defend the city. As the Russian forces approached Dresden, he fled with the German Home Guard to Joachimsthal, Czechoslovakia. But how did this poor farmer end up with the German army after spending his life in Lithuania? The answer to that question lies in the story of the Stehr family and stretches back over 200 years. In 1731, the Prince Archbishop decided to finally purge the valleys around Salzburg of Lutheran Protestants. He issued the Edict of Expulsion and expected most of these farmers to convert to Catholicism and a few to leave. Over 17,000 came forward to admit their faith. They were forced to leave with either 8 days or 3 months' notice if they owned homes. Luckily, King Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia accepted these settlers into the far eastern part of his country to repopulate an area wiped out by famine and plague. And somewhere in that mass of humanity winding its way to eastern Prussia were some of Willie's ancestors. The Stehr family settled near the northeast border region of Prussia. In 1866, Willie's father, Ludwig Stehr, was born in Belarus. And to the northwest, his mother, Auguste Hempfler, was born in Toreg, Lithuania. They married and had 7 children. Their oldest son, Willie, Friedrich Wilhelm, born 1896, married a distant cousin named Martha, and they had 8 children. Willie's family lived in Zymaku Naumistus, known in German as Neustadt. Both Naumistus and Neustadt mean new city. And though the borders changed, the family kept German as their first language and identified as Germans, since Prussia had joined Germany when it unified in 1871. This picture, taken in 1939, shows the family in front of their home. To the far left is Willie's youngest brother Raphael with his hands on the shoulder of Willie's daughter Marta. Next is their neighbor Tamitas. Willie's eldest daughter Elma stands next to his mother Auguste. Willie's wife Martha stands with her baby Ludwig in her arms in the center, and their daughter Emma in front. Next is Willie with a birch bough, and his oldest son Eric is to the right. 2 neighbors stand to the far right, and other neighbors, the Nasidius, stand to the back. This picture is interesting because it shows an Easter tradition in Lithuania. Of all of the countries in Europe, Lithuania embraced Christianity with the least enthusiasm. They would carve statues of wood depicting Christ on the cross and call them Godheads, and they would use them as fence posts to scare away evil spirits. The Easter scene shown in this picture features Willie with a birch bough. People would keep the birch bough indoors during the winter in water, and by Easter it would bud. On Easter they would take the bough to friends' houses, and they would use the bough to scare away evil spirits. The family lived in Naumistus until 1941 when the Russians occupied Lithuania. Around that time they received naturalization papers from Germany and moved there. But soon after, Germany invaded Lithuania and the family moved back to the farm. It seemed like they might escape most of the horrors of the war raging around them. But in 1944, the Russians approached again, and they all fled Germany again. And Willie's luck was about to run out. When the Russians liberated Czechoslovakia and captured the German army there in May 1945, Willie's fate was sealed. He was processed with the soldiers and taken to a labor camp in Marienburg near Hanover in Germany. He did hard manual labor with little food. At that time, he could have been kept in Germany and released with other Germans in due time. But the Russians, seeing his birthplace, decided he was Soviet Lithuanian and sent him to a prison in Toreg, Lithuania. He was kept with 40 men in one room. Russians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, and Germans together were forced to work from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. The work consisted of sawing and chiseling, mopping and emptying excrement buckets, and cleaning rooms. His German passport was forcefully taken away from him. In November 1945, he was sent to a city called Barishki. The work there included digging ditches that were then filled in by other prisoners. In January 1946, he was sent to Krasnoyarsk in Siberia. He was under watch by the dreaded NKVD, Stalin's newly formed secret police. They were more brutal and had full autonomy to pronounce and execute death sentences. This was a prison camp for foreigners like him, as well as commissioned and non-commissioned officers of the Red Army. Political prisoners were also held there. The rooms they slept in had many holes, and the only covering they had were the cotton jackets they wore during the day. They were woken up during the night to work as well as through the entire day. In mid-August, he was taken for interrogation. He was thoroughly questioned about his party affiliations and received an offer to work for them that he turned down, even at the risk of dying of hunger. As they received no incriminating evidence from or about him, they decided to send him back to Soviet Lithuania to his hometown to collect local information about him. They hinted that they had information there that would incriminate him and send him back to the camp permanently. With no money for travel, he set out to return to Naumistus. By cattle car to Moscow, to Vilnius, Kaunas, Memel, Salute, and finally to Naumistus. In his hometown, he was known as someone who had been negative to the Nazis and had never turned against the local people. He was spared the trip back to Siberia. He was assigned to work for the mayor. He was not paid, but sometimes received small amounts of money from him. He did hard manual labor and looked after his mother at their home. In Germany, his brother Raphael was working to restore Willie's expropriated civil rights. On January 29, 1955, he applied to the mayor of Frankfurt for resettlement for him and his mother. The application was approved and sent to the district president in Wiesbaden and finally to the Minister of the Interior. On December 17, 1955, a certificate of citizenship was issued and his passport was approved. The documentation was sent to the Lithuanian capital Vilnius and approved despite his mandatory Lithuanian citizenship. Further permits were required to allow him to transit through Poland and East Germany. His mother, hoping to be reunited with her family, died on the day his Polish visa arrived. Willie arrived on German soil on May 15, 1958, over 13 years since he was captured by the Russians. He learned his wife and children, first Valdemar and then the rest, had emigrated to Quebec, Canada, where most had worked for Willie's brother Arthur in his filter factory. He also learned that one of his sons, Reinhold, had died shortly after the war while playing with an undetonated hand grenade. A friend had died immediately, and he had died 6 hours later as they tried to take him to the hospital in a wooden cart. On June 11, 1958, Willie received authorization from the Canadian government to rejoin his family in Montreal, Quebec. He lived happily and quietly with his wife Martha in Eric and daughter-in-law Rose's home in Chamonix-Laval, near Montreal. Despite his long and exhausting ordeal, he was able to see his family grow and prosper in this new and peaceful country. Friedrich Wilhelm Stehr, born in 1896, died of a heart attack in 1971 in the living room of his son's home in Montreal. Marta Stehr, once again separated from her husband, lived for 22 more years. She passed away in 1993. Like her husband, she never again had to suffer the hardships she endured during the war, and always knew her family was safe. Though they are both long gone, their legacy continues.